equipping Ukraine in that defensive activity. Of course, we will continue and indeed have intensified commitment towards that. I was pleased to hear his commitment to cross-party working on this. Of course, my party was determined to ensure we had that cross-party working when in opposition, so I was pleased to hear him affirming that from his new position on the opposite benches. And indeed, we will ensure that we prioritise our support for Ukraine in the future, and I hope he will be working with us in ensuring that. Thank you.
Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. In anticipation of this urgent question, I asked a constituent friend of mine who's currently in Kiev what questions I should be asking the Foreign Secretary. And she will be, of course, very reassured that we are increasing the amount of armaments and weapons being sent to Ukraine because they're in desperate need for that. But overnight, Kiev was hit 20 times by missiles. And the overwhelming question that she wants me to ask is what pressure can the UK government put on the Americans to allow the Ukrainians to hit the missile sites in Russia?
Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising these matters, and clearly her contact with that constituent has been incredibly important to understand the situation on the ground. I know that she has a deep understanding of these foreign policy matters as well. The UK is well aware that the US has committed $105 billion in support for Ukraine. It also announced that at the NATO summit at the beginning of July of this year that Germany, Romania, the Netherlands and Italy would be working with the US to provide Ukraine with 5 strategic air defence systems. We've very much welcomed sustained bipartisan US support for Ukraine, which has been absolutely key in the international effort. And I know that the United States will want to continue that support into the future, and certainly we in the UK will be doing all that we can to ensure that remains the case. Thank you.
Lib Dem spokesperson Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Foreign Secretary has spoken of his warm relations with the running mate of Donald Trump, J.D. Vance. And it is just as well, because Vance has said previously that he doesn't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or another. While Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister is talking about changes to Russia's doctrine on the use of nuclear weapons, Vance is joking about how Britain is somehow the first Islamist country with nuclear weapons. Can the Minister tell the House what efforts the government is making to rid Vance and some others in the Republican Party of the idea that the security of Ukraine and the security of Europe is somehow not important to the security of the United States?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's clearly not for us in this House to speculate about hypothetical scenarios. Decisions about the US election will, of course, lie with the American people. And I would underline to him that the UK and US have been steadfast allies, working closely together on foreign policy issues, defence matters, for over a century. That is applied with leaders of all political stripes in the White House and in Downing Street Parliament and Congress as well. We will welcome and continue to welcome sustained bipartisan US support for Ukraine, including passage of the supplemental funding package, which has been absolutely key to the international effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker. Welcome the statement from my Vice Honourable friend. She did touch on the issue about stockpiles and armaments and missiles, and as she knows, we've had a long-standing problem in terms of those stockpiles. Could you say more about what work is being done now to ensure that those stockpiles are increased and that we can supply more to Ukraine?
So I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising that issue, and we will continue to work very hard to ensure that Ukraine has what it needs to defend itself in the face of Putin's illegal aggression. As I mentioned in my statement, of course, the Prime Minister has committed to £3 billion a year of military support for Ukraine until 2030-31, or for as long as is needed. And that means that the UK has committed almost £12.7 billion in military, humanitarian and economic support for Ukraine since 2022. But I want to be clear that we are stepping up our military support. That's included via a new package that was announced by the Defence Secretary in Odessa early July. That was very, very soon after the election. That includes, for example, more artillery guns, 250,000 ammunition rounds and 90 precision brimstone missiles, because the stockpile is indeed important, as he mentions.
Fire of the House, Sir Edward Lee.
It seems to me that if you're attacked by a demented bear, you either run away or you hit him so hard that he runs away. But our policy of the West in Ukraine appears to be to wound and not win. In that context, will this government make an unequivocal statement in public that Ukraine should be allowed to use Storm Shadow and, more importantly, the US-made Army tactical missile system, then we might actually win this war?
Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On that specific issue of Storm Shadow, there has been no change in the UK's position. We have been providing military aid to support Ukraine's clear right of self-defence against Russia's illegal attacks. That has been in accordance with international humanitarian law. And we are clear that equipment provided by the UK is intended for the defence of Ukraine.
Gordon McKay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The States will be going to the polls later this year, and that many in the Republican Party are unfortunately expressing scepticism of supporting Ukraine. So can I ask the Minister to encourage our colleagues and allies in the United States that support for Ukraine is vital for our own democracy and security around the world?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to my friend for mentioning this important subject. The UK will continue to work closely with our international partners to ensure Ukraine gets the support it needs to resist Russian aggression. And at the NATO summit in Washington, the Prime Minister announced that the UK-administered International Fund for Ukraine will place a new order that will be worth £300 million for 120,000 rounds of ammunition, bolstering Ukraine's defences against Russia. I should also mention that the UK is co-leading a new maritime capability coalition alongside Norway, which will strengthen Ukraine's ability to operate at sea, and a major drone capability coalition with Latvia to scale up the West provision of first-person view drones to Ukraine. So there is extensive and deep work with our allies when it comes to supporting the defence of Ukraine.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Does the government have a view why certain far-right politicians in the United States, in Europe, and even, dare I say it, in Britain, seem to have a soft spot for President Putin's Russia?
Well, the honourable member, I believe, raises a very important question. It's very clear that Russia's activity under President Putin's illegal leadership has been not only an attack on Ukraine, but of course an attack on democratic values, on international humanitarian law as well. And I'm very pleased that we've seen bipartisan support across this House rejecting that aggression, and I do hope that will continue.
Dan Carlton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Minister's words on Ukraine's activities in Kursk and ask her to give perhaps the fullest possible support from the UK government for what is going on there? Last night, Russian missiles hit Kyiv and other major cities, and it's vital that the UK takes the lead in partnering Ukraine in the defence of democracy and liberty. So can I also ask the Minister, what progress is the government making on completing the 100-year agreement with Ukraine?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I very much agree with my friend in his comments about the, first of all, about the Kursk offensive, as was mentioned previously, on the situation in Kursk. It ultimately is a defensive operation, and we should not forget, of course, that Russia has repeatedly launched attacks on Ukraine from Kursk Oblast, so this very much was a defensive operation. I also agree with his comments, of course, about recent aerial attacks from Russia, and when it comes to the rejection of those, we could not be clearer. Intentionally directing attacks at civilian objects is a war crime. Those attacks threaten civilian access to power, heating and water supply, impacting the safety and livelihoods of millions of Ukrainians. And we also, in relation to the question about the 100-year partnership, we're committed to ensuring that we cement our partnership with the leadership of Ukraine. That was one that started very early on for the new government. We know there's an important anniversary coming, and we're seeking to mark that with renewed partnership when it does.
Al Pinkerton.
Mr. Speaker, Russian oligarchs close to Putin have numerous assets under UK jurisdiction, equating to nearly £23 billion. Can the Speaker commit to acting on a Lib Dem manifesto commitment to begin the process of seizing currently frozen assets in the UK and repurposing those assets in support of the people of Ukraine, building financial resilience in UK domestic national support, even if US support were to waver following the US election in November? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question. He's absolutely right in what I believe is the implication of his question, which is that we need to have a robust sanctions regime. That's something that this government is absolutely committed to. Without sanctions, we estimate Russia would have over $400 billion more to fund its war for another 4 years. So it really is important that we continue with that sanctions regime and do what we can to ensure that it is impossible to circumvent. And I believe perhaps his point was around that particular issue. Now, there is an international system and movement towards ensuring that Russian sovereign assets are indeed put into play when it comes to support for people who've been so appallingly impacted in Ukraine. We are working intensively with all of our allies to pursue lawful ways to ensure that Russia meets its obligations, and together with our G7 partners, we've agreed to make available approximately $50 billion to Ukraine by the end of the year by advancing the extraordinary profits generated by immobilised Russian sovereign assets in the EU and other relevant jurisdictions. So work is already ongoing, I believe, on the issues that he mentioned, if I understand correctly. Thank you.
Lord MacDougall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome what the Minister said about the Russian shadow fleet and the efforts to tackle that. She'll also be aware that there's an estimated £600 million worth of refined products of Russian origin that have made their way into our economy. What more can she do, given her answer a moment ago about the need for a robust sanctions regime to crack down on that? Because the democracy in Kyiv will find it more difficult to win if we're also funding the dictatorship in Moscow.
I'm very grateful to my friend for raising this important point, because Putin's shadow fleet softened the blow of our sanctions regime, and it poses serious maritime security and environmental risks as well. Now, the new government has already taken decisive action in response. Earlier this month, we sanctioned 11 Russian ships, and almost all sanctioned tankers have ceased trading Russian oil. At the EPC summit, 44 countries, as I mentioned before, in the EU, signed a call to action that was spearheaded by the UK, calling out the risks posed by the shadow fleet and committing to work together to confront those risks. Now, I won't speculate on future decisions around our sanctions regime, but of course, we will always keep it under review.
Mark Francis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I follow the fire of the House's excellent point on Storm Shadow? There is no third country exercising a veto on how Putin uses long-range missiles, which he uses without compunction, even to attack children's hospitals in Ukraine. And yet the media consistently report there is an American veto on Ukrainian use of Storm Shadow missiles to attack targets at depth in Russia, even though that would materially assist the Ukrainian war effort. So can the Minister and the Foreign Office and the MOD talk with our American allies to get that veto removed, because the Ukrainians are fighting for our freedom too, and 2 years in, they can no longer be expected to do it with one hand tied behind their back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned previously in this important debate, the UK government will continue to work with all of our allies from all parties that are engaged in this, seeking to ensure we do all we can to protect Ukraine's sovereignty and to enable them to exercise their right of self-defence against Putin's illegal aggression. As I mentioned before, there has been no change in the UK's position on the matters that he specified. We have been providing military aid to support Ukraine's clear right of self-defence against Russia's illegal attacks in accordance with international humanitarian law, and we are clear that equipment provided by the UK is intended for the defence of Ukraine.
Jogi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Minister's the strength and detail of her statement. Now, my constituents in Newcastle-under-Lyme stand very firmly with the people of Ukraine, and last night I met a man called Alex, a Ukrainian who has made his life in Newcastle-under-Lyme. Now, he has no family left in the Ukraine after the recent death of his brother in Kyiv. Now, that's evidence, Mr. Speaker, that this crisis remains so very serious for so many people indeed. Now, notwithstanding the Minister's answer on sanctions and assets, can I urge her to look at what we can do to redouble our efforts to use the assets seized from Russian folks here to support Ukrainians in their fight against tyranny, not just in Ukraine, but here in the United Kingdom too?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I very much would share my friend's deep concern about the human impact of Putin's illegal war on Ukraine. Overall, we've heard, of course, in February 2024 from President Zelensky that 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed during Russia's full-scale invasion, and very large numbers of civilians have been as well. OHCHR reports over 11,000 civilians have been killed and over 23,000 wounded. That was as of the start of August this year. When it comes to ensuring that we take action on assets, this new government is absolutely committed to doing everything we can in this area. As I mentioned before, the UK sanctioned over 2,000 individuals and entities, and without sanctions, we estimate Russia would have over $400 billion more to fund its illegal war. Of course, we will continue to keep this under review and work with partners to ensure our sanctions are as strong as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is, of course, right when she said that the next US President is a matter solely for the American people. But a Trump presidency will, without doubt, have a significant impact on the course of the war in Ukraine. And given his relationship, his cosy relationship with Putin, I very much doubt that impact will be a positive one. So can she reassure this House, and I suspect the people of Ukraine, that this government is, or soon will be, speaking to our European allies to ensure that in terms of procurement and engagement, that Europe will be prepared to plug any gaps than what Ukraine needs to defend itself should the worst case become a reality after November?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question, and this government has repeatedly engaged with our allies on the need for continued support for Ukraine. That's been the case, for example, with the European political community, the meetings that we had there, the call to action that came out of that on the Shadow Fleet. It's been the case with all the engagement we've had, of course, with NATO allies as well, and also with the Prime Minister's engagement with Olaf Scholz and President Macron just a few days ago. So that will continue. It's critically important for the UK government. We have welcomed sustained bipartisan US support for Ukraine. It has been key to the international effort, and I would just underline what I said before. The UK and US have been steadfast allies, working closely together for over a century. That has applied regardless of political stripe across the institutions in both of our countries, and we're determined that will continue. Thank you.
Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the government's very positive response to this urgent question? But can I just press her on the storm shadow issue, because there's really no point in the West arming Ukraine to shoot down the missiles when they can't shoot down the launch pads. What discussions is the government having with our American counterparts? Will she confirm that a request has been made to the US administration? When are we expecting an answer? And if the answer is no, what will we do?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I believe that I have been crystal clear, and the UK government has been crystal clear, that we will do everything we can to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, and to ensure that it has the equipment it needs to defend its territory from Russia's illegal invasion. And he will understand that we will not comment on operational decision-making.
Samuel Wilson.
Mr. Speaker. Ukrainian refugees in my constituency have expressed their welcome that there's been continuity of approach to the situation in Ukraine after the change of government. The Minister has mentioned on a number of occasions today the fact that we are giving a long-term arms commitment to Ukraine. But given the concerns that there have been about, first of all, the equipment and ammunition available to our own armed forces, How can she make such a commitment, and what steps has she taken to ensure that the defence industry in the United Kingdom is geared up to meet both the commitments for our own armed forces and for the ones she's making to Ukraine?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the honourable member for making that absolutely critical point. And it's very clear that when we have that kind of long-term commitment to ensuring that there is provision of defence capacity to our allies, to our friends, that is not only important for those countries, and here, in this case, for Ukraine. It's also incredibly important for our own domestic industrial capacity as well. It ensures that we can, for the long term, secure jobs in our own country, that there are long-term contracts, long-term prospects, and indeed careers for people in our own country working in defence industries. Thank you.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week's attack on Ukraine by Russian missiles and drones represented the biggest since the Russian invasion of Ukraine started. Can she make it crystal clear that Ukraine's right to self-defence must include the ability to target where those missiles and drones originate, including Russian aircraft in Russian airspace and Russian missile bases?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And he's absolutely right to condemn the truly appalling recent attacks that we saw. They provided yet more evidence that Russia is seeking to, frankly, terrorise the Ukrainian population into submission. That is an approach that we wholly reject, that we condemn, that runs contrary, of course, to international humanitarian law. And the UK will continue to do everything we can to support Ukraine's resilience and to support its defence in this situation. And I did mention before, but I will just underline, given the point that he made on this subject, that of course when it comes to the Kursk operation, that was a defensive operation, and we should not forget that Russia reportedly and repeatedly launched attacks on Ukraine from Kursk Oblast.
Rachel Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the topic of Ukraine, we've heard about the role of Russian assets in this country. The Minister will be aware of the concerns that I have about asset ownership in the constituency of the cities of London and Westminster, and how vital it is for UK economic growth that we can pride ourselves on having a clean and transparent financial markets in the City of London. Does the Minister agree with me that securing transparency through trust ownership is a really important part of making sure that we can understand ownership of assets in this country, and that we can't wait any longer for enforcement around transparency of trust in order to secure our understanding of this situation?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I am very well aware of my friend's leadership on these issues and her long-term commitment to ensuring transparency. Of course, she will understand that precise rules around financial instruments are not for the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. They are instead, of course, for His Majesty's Treasury. However, I can say to her on the broader issue that we are very clear that effective sanctions will, of course, require effective enforcement and implementation, and will continue to strengthen our work, including with international partners and allies, and through our role at the UN, to maximise the impact of sanctions, to close loopholes and to close other channels for circumventing sanctions. Thank you.
Mundell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Right Honourable Lady recognise the enormous contribution which the Ukrainian diaspora here in the UK has made to supporting their countrymen, not just in practical terms but in morale terms? And will she ensure that the government continues to do everything it can to support their endeavours?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Member for mentioning that point, because it's incredibly important. I think just about every member in this House will have had the privilege and honour of meeting Ukrainians who've moved to their constituency, not, of course, sadly through choice, but through necessity. They've enriched our communities, and they are indeed supporting those back at home. It really is important that the government continues to work with them, both so we get an accurate picture of what's taking place, of course, but also so that we can ensure we play our part in supporting Ukraine in its self-defence against Putin's aggression.
Gurinder Singh Josant.
This House should commend the undoubted success of the brave Ukraine forces in their incursion into the Russian Kursk region. but we also see that they remain under significant stress across the whole region. Can the Minister identify what support the UK government has provided, military support the UK government has provided to the Ukraine Armed Forces since the general election, and what commitment we have in place going forward?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to my friend for raising that important question, and I want to be very clear that we are stepping up our military support for the reasons that he mentions. That includes via the new package that was announced, of course, in Odessa by the Defence Secretary. I think it was about in his second day in the job. That includes more artillery guns, 250,000 ammunition rounds, 90 precision brimstone missiles, and we are speeding up that support as well. So the Defence Secretary has also announced that we will ensure the package of military aid that was promised in April under the previous government, which includes air defence missiles, that's delivered in full to Ukraine within the next 100 days. That was on the 7th of July.
James Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What action is the government taking with our allies to crack down on sanction dodging, which is leading to critical components for military equipment, including drones, getting into Russia?
Well, this government is absolutely committed to ensuring that there is not sanctions dodging, that we have an effective sanctions regime. It's absolutely critical when it comes to ensuring that Putin's illegal war does not succeed, and over £20 billion worth of UK-Russia bilateral trade is now under full or partial sanction as we speak. Imports from Russia into the UK have fallen by more than 99%, and exports to Russia have fallen by more than 75%. Of course, I mentioned previously the fact that we've been working to tackle the so-called shadow fleet, working with our allies and partners to ensure we have robust action in that area, but we will continue to keep the system under review.
Graham Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Minister on both the tone and the substance of her response here today, and I see the Foreign Secretary coming into the chamber. The President of Ukraine has lauded the UK for its leadership in arms, politics, support for Ukrainian society. Can the Minister say, why did he say that since the election that support had slowed?
Well, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member for his question, but I have to say that the Prime Minister could not have been clearer that the UK's support for Ukraine is unwavering. This is a cross-party commitment coming from the UK, absolutely clear, and we continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. That's why, of course, the Prime Minister committed to £3 billion a year of support to Ukraine for as long as it takes within his first week in office. A new commitment, one we believed it was important to make to underline that continued support. And as a further signal of the strength of the relationship, you'll remember that the Prime Minister called President Zelensky on his first day in the job, and the Defence Secretary visited Kyiv just hours later. So that commitment could not be clearer. Thank you.
Andrew Studden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. BAE Systems in my constituency in Fylde and its workforce across Lancashire, indeed from the Speaker's constituency as well, in Chorley, has been at the forefront of the armaments supply to Ukraine. The Typhoon project at the Wharton site starts to hit a lull from next year, where there is no more assembly of Typhoons. But we know that countries directly affected by Russia's aggression across its border wish to place Typhoon orders in coming years. But there will be a delay in which we can critically supply those important aircraft to strategic partners. And will the Minister commit to working with myself, other MPs from Lancashire and BAE Systems on how we can fill that gap in the production assembly of Typhoon fighter jets to make sure that when our allies and partners need those jets, that they will be available, and to the benefit as well for jobs across Lancashire and indeed for exports for the UK economy?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I would want to pay tribute to those British workers who have been ensuring that absolutely essential material is being delivered when it's so much needed, and that really does show UK technology, of course, at its best. And I'm assured that the Defence Secretary would be keen to meet with him. He's well aware of these challenges. He'd be interested in ensuring there's that conversation. And of course, the new UK government has been absolutely clear that we're determined to have a long-term strategy strategy for defence that includes for our defence industries as well.
Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As with so many things in international affairs, American support is indispensable, and so it is in support for Ukraine. Yet the election of President Trump et al. Threatens that. Has the government conducted any contingency planning as to how to continue full support for Ukraine in the event of the potential election of President Trump?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I'm grateful to the member for his question. I don't want to repeat word for word what I said previously. He will, I'm sure, understand that the US and UK have worked together over 100 years on issues of importance. That has not varied despite the party political composition of leaderships in our two countries. We will not be speculating about hypothetical scenarios. Instead, we will be ensuring that we continue to work with our allies to ensure that the Ukrainian people who have so bravely been defending their country are supported in their self-defence by the UK. Thank you.
That leaves us with just Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank very much the Minister for her very confident answers. They will encourage us all in this House and indeed our constituents back home as well, and thank her for that. As the Minister stated in her statement, as our children, in my case my 6 grandchildren, and indeed all the other children, make their way back into their classrooms in safety and security today, our minds are with those children in Ukraine unable to access an education, a hope, or indeed even a future. Can the Minister outline what discussions have taken place to ensure that those children remaining in Ukraine have access to their education, to vocational training, and indeed to a very future? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the honourable member for that very important point, and want to thank him for his kind words as well, and congratulate him on 6 grandchildren. I'm sure I've heard that before, but that is quite an achievement. He, of course, raises an incredibly important, maybe not entirely just down to him, of course, but the issue that he raises, is clearly a very sad one indeed, and it is about the fact that we see, of course, children being put in a very difficult position. Indeed, we've seen appalling levels actually of children who've been killed due to that Russian aggression, but also then the impact on essential services for them, whether that be education, but also healthcare as well, with some of the impacts of the conflict that we've seen. And I would want to assure him, we haven't really managed to cover this in the debate, Mr. Speaker, but that the UK, when it comes to humanitarian support, is absolutely committed to supporting Ukraine. I've been working very hard on that as Minister for Development, as he would expect, and that will include across a range of services, but particularly humanitarian matters and energy as we come into the winter too. Thank you.
Right, that completes the UQ. We will now move on to the statement. Let the front benches change over. Right, we now come to the Middle East oral statement. Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, with permission, Mr. Speaker, I will make a statement on the Middle East. On taking office in July, I told this House that this government's priority in the region would be to advance the cause of peace. And this continues to be our mission on every front. In Israel, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in the Red Sea, and of course in Gaza, where we need an immediate ceasefire, the protection of civilians, the immediate release of all hostages, and more aid getting into Gaza. Over the summer, we were faced with the prospect of full-scale war breaking out between Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel. On each of the 3 visits I've made to the region, including alongside my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, and most recently a joint visit with the French Foreign Minister Ségoné, I have urged Lebanese Hezbollah, the Lebanese government and Israel to engage with the US-led discussions to resolve their disagreements diplomatically and to reach a peaceful resolution through the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1701. And as we continue to work with our allies and partners to push for a diplomatic solution, we nonetheless stand ready for the worst-case scenario, including the potential evacuation of British nationals. And our message to those still in Lebanon remains clear: leave now. Mr. Speaker, our common goal of peace in the Middle East will never be lasting until there is safety, security and sovereignty for both Israel and a Palestinian state. We must all keep at the forefront of our minds the pain, the anguish, the horror that this conflict has caused for so many ordinary civilians. The victims of the October the 7th atrocity, the hostages, and all those still enduring unimaginable suffering, whether they're hoping to see their loved ones again or mourning their loss, as the tragic events of this weekend illustrate, as the bodies of 6 murdered hostages were recovered. The Israeli people still living under rocket fire, not only from Hamas, but from other hostile actors explicitly dedicated to Israel's annihilation, fighting an enemy in Hamas whose appalling tactics endanger countless civilian lives. And the innocent Palestinians, tens of thousands killed in the fighting, their numbers growing by the day, including distressing numbers of women and children, many mothers so malnourished they cannot produce milk for their babies, families struggling to keep their children alive, disease and famine looming ever larger, heroic humanitarians putting their lives on the line to help others, like the brave aid workers I met from the United Nations agencies, and from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society warehouse I visited alongside France's Foreign Minister last month. Indeed, last Thursday, the UK led a session at the United Nations Security Council encouraging a continued global focus on the protection of civilians in Gaza, including the need for action on polio. And now, deeply worrying, the escalation we're seeing in the West Bank as well as in Gaza, with many communities facing settler violence amid an ongoing occupation, and so many on either side of this terrible conflict convinced that the world does not grasp the reality of Israel's predicament or the depth of Palestinian suffering. Throughout my life, I have been a friend of Israel, a liberal, progressive Zionist who believes in Israel as a democratic state and a homeland for the Jewish people, which has both the right to exist and defend itself. But I believe also that Israel will only exist in safety and security if there is a two-state solution that guarantees the rights of all Israeli citizens and their Palestinian neighbours, who have their own inalienable right to self-determination and security. Mr. Speaker, as concern at the horrifying scenes in Gaza has risen, many in this House, as well as esteemed lawyers and international organisations, have raised British arms export licensing to Israel. After raising my own concerns from opposition on taking office, I immediately sought to update the review. And on my first appearance as Foreign Secretary in this House, I committed to sharing the review's conclusions. We have rigorously followed every stage of the process which the previous Conservative government established. And let me first be clear on the review's scope. This government is not an international court. We have not and could not arbitrate on whether or not Israel has breached international humanitarian law. This is a forward-looking evaluation, not a determination of innocence or guilt, and it does not prejudge any future determinations by the competent courts. But facing a conflict such as this, it is this government's legal duty to review export licences. Criteria 2C of the Strategic Export Licensing Criteria states that the government will not issue export licences if there is a clear risk that the items might be used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law. It is with regret that I inform the House today the assessment I have received leaves me unable to conclude anything other than that for certain UK arms exports to Israel, there does exist a clear risk that they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. I have informed my Right Honourable friend, the Business and Trade Secretary, and he is therefore today announcing the suspension of around 30 from a total of approximately 350 to Israel as required under the Export Controls Act. These include equipment that we assess is for use in the current conflict in Gaza, such as important components which go into military aircraft, including fighter aircraft, helicopters and drones, as well as items which facilitate ground targeting. And for transparency, this government is publishing a summary of our assessment. Today I want to underline 4 points about these decisions. First, Israel's actions in Gaza continue to lead to immense loss of civilian life, widespread destruction to civilian infrastructure, and immense suffering. In many cases, it's not been possible to reach a determinative conclusion on allegations regarding Israel's conduct of hostilities, in part because there is insufficient information either from Israel or other reliable sources to verify such claims. Nevertheless, it is the assessment of His Majesty's government that Israel could reasonably do more to ensure life-saving food and medical supplies reach civilians in Gaza, in light of the appalling humanitarian situation. And this government is also deeply concerned by credible claims of mistreatment of detainees, which the International Committee of the Red Cross cannot investigate after being denied access to places of detention. Both my predecessor and all our major allies have repeatedly and forcefully raised these concerns with the Israeli government. Regrettably, they have not been addressed satisfactorily. Second, there can be no doubt that Hamas pays not the slightest heed to international humanitarian law and endangers civilians by embedding itself in the tightly concentrated civilian population and in civilian infrastructure. There is no equivalence between Hamas terrorists and Israel's democratic government, or indeed Iran and their partners and proxies. But to license arms exports to Israel, we must assess their compliance with international humanitarian law, notwithstanding the abhorrence of their opponents' tactics and ideology. Third, this is not a blanket ban. This is not an arms embargo. It targets around 30, approximately 350 licenses to Israel in total for items which could be used in the current conflict in Gaza. The rest will continue. Neither will the action we are taking have a material impact on Israel's security. This suspension only covers items which might be used in the current conflict. There are a number of export licenses which we have assessed are not for military use in the current conflict and therefore do not require suspension, and these include items that are not being used by the Israel Defence Forces in the current conflict, such as trainee aircraft or other naval equipment. And these also include export licenses for civilian use, covering a range of products such as food testing chemicals, telecoms and data equipment. Nor will it prejudge the international collaboration global F-35 programme that supplies aircraft for more than 20 countries. And that is crucial to wider peace and security. Indeed, the effects of suspending all licenses for the F-35 programme would undermine the global F-35 supply chain that is vital for the security of the UK, our allies and NATO. Therefore, the Business and Trade Secretary has exempted these licenses from his decision. Fourth, the government will keep our position under review. Commitment to comply with international humanitarian law is not the only criteria in making export licensing decisions. We will continue to work with our allies to improve the situation, and foreign policy, of course, involves tough choices. But I will always seek to take such decisions in line with our principles, and I will keep this House updated in line with the previous commitment. Mr. Speaker, we do not take this decision lightly, but we note that on previous occasions, ministers from all sides of the House, Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrat, chose not to license exports to Israel. In 1982, Margaret Thatcher imposed a full arms embargo and oil embargo on Israel as they fought in Lebanon. Conflicts in Gaza prompted Gordon Brown to suspend 5 licenses in 2009, and Vince Cable chose not to issue new licences while conducting a review in 2014. Like them, this government takes seriously its role in applying export licensing law, reflecting the published criteria and the specific circumstances. But let me leave this House in no doubt. The UK continues to support Israel's right to self-defence in accordance with international law. In April, British fighter jets intercepted Iranian missiles aimed at Israel, preventing significant loss of civilian life. We supported robust action against the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen, who have attacked Israel directly as well as Israel-linked shipping. And Iran should be in no doubt of our commitment to challenge their reckless and destabilising activity in the region and across the world. We will continue to work hand in glove with our international partners to stand up to Iranian aggression and malign activity wherever it is found. And we continue to hold Iran to account, including through extensive sanctions. And today, we're doing so again. We're announcing new sanctions on 4 IRGC force targets who have a role in supporting Iranian proxy actions in Iraq, Syria and Lebanon through the UK's dedicated Iran sanctions regime. We've sanctioned over 400 Iranian individuals and entities. And through our work with partners, we are exposing and containing Iran's destabilising weapons development, where soon we'll be introducing further regulations to bolster existing bans on the export of goods and technology significant to Iran's production of drones and missiles. So let me be clear. We will continue to work with Israel and our partners to tackle the threat from Iran across the region. This government will continue to stand for Israel's security, and we will always do so in a manner consistent with our obligations to domestic and international law. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Shadow Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Mr. Speaker, over the weekend we were once again reminded of the tragic human toll of this conflict, with Israel recovering the bodies of 6 more innocent hostages murdered by Hamas. The only way, Mr. Speaker, this conflict will be brought to an end and for the suffering to end is through the release of those hostages. This cruel captivity has lasted almost a year. Their suffering and jeopardy is intolerable for Israel, and it should be intolerable for anyone who cares about human rights and human dignity. Many of us in this House have met with the families of the hostages, even in the midst of unimaginable pain and anxiety. They keep the torch burning for their loved ones, publicly highlighting their plight and tremendous bravery. And let us be clear, Mr. Speaker, the onus is on Hamas. They are using the Palestinian people as human shields. Hamas has no humanity and it has no shame. And as Hamas inflicts terrible suffering on both the Israeli and Palestinian people, it should not be forgotten that another Iranian-backed proxy, Hezbollah, is engaged in continuous attacks on Israel's northern border, with the risk of further and yet more dangerous escalation across the blue line. Our support for Israel's security is rock solid in the face of threats from those who wish it serious harm, just as we showed in April this year when British personnel and weaponry were used to counter Iran's massive missile attack. We will look carefully, Mr. Speaker, at the limited arms embargo memorandum that the Foreign Secretary has promised the House. While he rightly does not publish his legal advice, we are grateful that he is honouring the promise I gave to the Business and Trade Committee on publishing as much as possible on this. And he will, I know, and as he said, be careful not to indicate in any way at all any moral equivalence between Hamas and the democratically elected government of Israel. In government, Mr. Speaker, we introduced sanctions to undermine Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We also sanctioned extremist Israeli settlers who committed human rights abuses against Palestinian communities in the West Bank. And we welcome the new sanctions the Foreign Secretary has announced today on 4 IRGC Quds force targets. Mr. Speaker, implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1701 remains our best hope of de-escalation and peace along the blue line. Resolution 1701 provides a roadmap which everyone should seek to follow, and we welcome the government's reaffirmation of its support for Resolution 1701. In relation to British nationals in Lebanon, it is very much our hope that since the House last considered this matter, shortly before the recess, the number of Brits who have registered their presence in Lebanon and departed from the country has risen. Mr. Speaker, I want to reiterate that the situation in the West Bank has also deteriorated and become yet more tense. While Israel must protect its vital security interests, we urge the Netanyahu government to do so in such a way that minimises the risk of yet further instability and escalation. Turning finally to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, we want to convey our thanks to the WHO and UNICEF staff who have been racing to get polio vaccinations administered across Gaza. They are doing vital work during this agreed pause. And pauses offer the potential, Mr. Speaker, to get much needed humanitarian aid in, but also a window to get the hostages out. And pauses can help create the conditions necessary to bring about a sustainable peace. And on the distribution of aid, we strongly support calls for watertight deconfliction processes and the utmost protection of aid workers. Humanitarian aid can only make a difference if it is properly and safely distributed. Guaranteed deconfliction for aid convoys and other humanitarian work is absolutely essential. It is by road and truck that aid must be able to reach Gaza by all routes. This should make humanitarian aid delivery by air and sea unnecessary. Could the Foreign Secretary provide the House with more detail about how we are playing our part in international efforts to get more aid over the border to desperate people? To conclude, Mr. Speaker, we all want the terrible suffering of both the Israeli and Palestinian people to end. It does feel as if we are at a point where this conflict could go in two radically different directions. While the region faces a potential conflagration, it is also possible that cooler heads on all sides might prevail. Britain's role must be to help facilitate a sustainable end to the current suffering. It is only then that we can achieve our aim of lifting people's eyes to the prospect of a different horizon in the future.
Well, I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker, to the Shadow Foreign Secretary for the tone of his response. He will know, as well as anyone, that these are complex and sober questions, and it's right that the House can debate them in the appropriate tone and spirit this afternoon. And I recall that Lord Cameron said that he was concerned that Israel had violated international humanitarian law, that the Shadow Foreign Secretary himself has repeatedly called on Israel to abide by international humanitarian law, and said that in certain actions that they may not have complied with international humanitarian law. And in April, the Shadow Minister, the Honourable Member for Rutland and Stamford, who was in her seat slightly earlier, said that the UK had no choice but to suspend arms. So he can recognise that this is not a partisan issue, and I'm very grateful for the tone that he's taken in this debate. I have provided the House with a summary today on the issue of the way that I have made the assessment, and indeed in doing so I have been more transparent than any government has been in the past about decisions like this, because I recognise the exceptional public interest there is in this debate. He's right, like me, to underline that there is no moral equivalence between Hamas, who began this atrocity on October the 7th, and the prosecution of getting those hostages out and defending itself, even though that I have said that there is a clear risk in relation to our export licensing regime. He's right to talk about the context in Lebanon, to support indeed the government's message that UK nationals should leave, and let me assure him that I have not just visited Lebanon now on many occasions, but spoken to the Lebanese Prime Minister on 3 occasions just in the last few weeks. And of course, in the West Bank, we recognise the important security concerns of Israel, but we are deeply concerned with the way that we see these actions being prosecuted over the last few days, and we call for de-escalation. And of course, in terms of the situation in Gaza, successive foreign secretaries now have raised with the Israelis, and I raised it directly with Prime Minister Netanyahu, that not enough trucks are getting in. And it is still the case today, after 11 months of conflict, that not enough trucks are getting in. And the Minister for Development was in Jordan, assessing the situation from there, as I was just before that with the Red Crescent. It has been important for us to demonstrate leadership in the UN and to press to get these pauses so the children of Gaza can be vaccinated against polio. We have that pause in place, I think, between 8 a.m. and 2 a.m. Or 2 p.m. In the afternoon, so that those children can get the vaccinations they need so that they don't suffer.
John Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Secretary of State, for your important statement today. It is clear, and I agree with the Shadow Minister, that Hamas has no humanity and no shame. Some have said that there's only a pause to vaccinate children because polio may spread beyond Gaza. With so many children killed in this war, I understand why some may say that. The World Health Organization says that at least 90% of children under 10 must be immunized in a very short period of time. With that in mind, can the Secretary of State please tell the House what measures this government is taking to ensure further agreements are made to have a pause for as long as possible that both sides can adhere to?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I was very pleased to meet with the member for Oxford East, with Dr. Tedros, who leads the World Health Organization, to discuss these issues and his particular concerns about disease and polio in the area. We continue to press for a ceasefire. We are working with all colleagues to get that ceasefire. Just before coming to this House, President Biden has confirmed that the ceasefire is within reach. And I urge all sides now to make that ceasefire happen and bring these horrors to an end and get those hostages out.
Lib Dem spokesperson Leila Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week we received the terrible news of the deaths of 6 Israeli hostages, among them Hirsch Goldberg-Polin, whose mother Rachel I met when I was last in Jerusalem. I cannot imagine her pain. And that pain is not diluted by the pain of so many others. Yes, other Israeli hostage families, but also thousands of families in Gaza for the dead there. And to all, I'm sure, we send our deepest condolences. In the West Bank, we have seen horrific violence as Israeli forces launched an operation inside refugee camps, terrifying children in their beds and accused of breaking their own codes of conduct. The situation seems to only go from bad to worse. So I welcome the Foreign Secretary's remarks about the suspension of some arms exports licenses to the IDF. But given the seriousness of the ICC and the ICJ cases, there remain questions about the many hundreds of others. So I look forward to reading the published summary. I urge the government to go further. Will they not ban goods produced in the illegal Israeli settlements? If the settlements are illegal, why are we allowing trade with them? And will they sanction Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, as the EU's Joseph Borrell is considering? Or can he at least say that when it comes to violent extremists, nothing and no one is off the table? Speaking in December last year, Hirsch's mother, Rachel, said to the UN General Assembly, "We are at a crossroads." And when I say we, I don't mean Jews, Muslims or Christians, Americans, Palestinians, Europeans, Israelis, Ukrainian, Russians. I mean we humans. We can keep dividing the world into the paradigm of them versus us, or we can start thinking about those who are willing and those who are not. This could have all been so different. Imagine if the world had listened to her then in December. And so I urge the government, be bolder. That is the only way to make that promise of peace a reality. And that, of course, has to start, rather than end, with that immediate ceasefire.
Foreign Secretary.
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady. And let me just say on the hostages that I've now personally spoken to or met all of the British and UK-linked hostages and heard for myself the suffering that they've endured since their loved ones were taken on the 7th of October. There needs to be an end to this nightmare. And there is now tremendous grief, pain and trauma whenever you visit Israel and meet with hostage families, as I have continued to do. She's right to raise the issues on the West Bank. We are deeply concerned by the ongoing IDF military operation in the occupied West Bank and the attacks from Palestinian militants. We recognise, of course, the need to defend itself, Israel's need to defend itself against security threats, but we are deeply worried by the methods that Israel has employed and by reports of civilian casualties and the destruction of civilian infrastructure particularly. It's in no one's interest to further conflict and instability to spread that to the West Bank. We condemn the settler expansion, the record levels that we've seen this year particularly, and of course the increase in settler violence. And I condemn the language that's been used by ministers in the Israeli government, Smodrik, Ben-Gvir, particularly in relation to this. It's entirely unacceptable language and should be condemned by the government or the Israeli government as a whole. She raises important issues and she recognised that, of course, in terms of labelling, we do label in relation to goods from settlements alongside the 1967 borders particularly, but the issues are very, very complex.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The escalation of military violence in the West Bank has led to the reported deaths of Palestinians and increased settler violence, resulting in illegal occupation and violent land theft. Amid this escalation, the US has imposed sanctions on Israeli groups. Medical Aid Palestine have claimed the UK government has not acted with due urgency. So, can the Foreign Secretary clarify the government's position on this issue and what immediate actions the government will be taking other than condemnation of this action?
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, can I reassure my honourable friend that we are keeping this under review? We are in dialogue with our closest allies on this issue, and we will not flinch in dealing with the issues at hand if we need to.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Can the Foreign Secretary assure the House that what appears to be a carefully calibrated response to a dreadful situation will not in any way impair the valuable cooperation between Israel and the United Kingdom, where the sharing of intelligence about international terrorist activity is concerned?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman is amongst the very few in this House who understand the breadth and depth and importance for our own national security of that relationship. We have a very important people-to-people relationship with Israel. 250 UK Jewish nationals here in this country. We have a very important trading relationship with Israel, but the cooperation on intelligence, military and security is essential, not just to our national interests, but to the global security of much of the world. And so I've made this decision with regret. It's in sorrow, not in anger. And he will understand that others, in fact Conservative governments, have gone for a full arms embargo We have not done that today because we recognise with Hezbollah, with the Houthis, with Hamas, it is right that Israel has the means to defend itself.
Emily Thornbury.
Mr. Speaker, could my right honourable friend just reiterate the very important point, which is this is not an arms embargo on Israel. We continue to support Israel's right to defend itself and will continue to sell it arms, but that the rules underpinning our control of arms are as they have always been, which is that the UK will not permit the sale of arms if they might be used for internal repression or international aggression. And for that reason, we have cut the number of arms export licences by 30.
Secretary of State.
Well, my right honourable friend spent a few more years at the bar than I did. And she knows that in making this very sober assessment, it is based, Mr. Speaker, on a clear risk. And on the basis of that clear risk, it is arms and weaponry that may be used in Gaza that we have sought, and it amounts to around 30 that we have sought to suspend. It's of course our sincere hope that we get to that ceasefire and the sustained position that will allow us, of course, to resume working in the way that we would normally work with our Israeli friends.
Walters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too met the mother of Hirsch Goldberg-Polin in Jerusalem, and it's a terrible tragedy that his name has joined the list of many thousands of innocents who've died in this conflict over the last few months on both sides. Now, the Secretary of State will know that I've been long concerned about the situation in the West Bank. And I understand that the measures he's taken today, and indeed sanctions generally, are not purely performative. He wants them to have some bite. So I wanted to ask you about the case of Hilltop Youth today. This organisation, violent settler organisation, was sanctioned by the previous government earlier this year and was recently described as a bunch of terrorists by the head of the Internal Security Service in Israel. And yet our sanctions seemingly have had no impact on their behaviour or their conduct and the violent persecution that they're visiting upon innocent Palestinians in the West Bank. So will he consider extending our sanctions to those who support and sustain this organisation and others, both within Israel and externally? Because if we're going to be taken seriously on an international stage, whether it's in Iran, in the case of Iran, or these violent organisations, our measures have to have bite and effect, and at the moment, seemingly, they aren't.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the right honourable gentleman who has raised these issues consistently in this House now over many years is absolutely right to draw focus to what is happening on the West Bank. And that is not because of the immediate violence that we've seen over the last 2 days. It's because the level of violence, the expansion, the sense of impunity that one sees when one is in the West Bank is of huge concern. Can I reassure him that I continue to work with allies and I continue to keep these matters under close review?
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement. I speak as a long-term friend of Palestine and an advocate of a two-state solution. I'm sure you'd agree with me when it comes to the release of hostages. We want to see all hostages released in their hundreds and thousands. But I'd ask him particularly what assessment he's made of the impact of his suspension of 30 of these licences, because Israel has shown little sign of responding to pressure from the outside world. And along with the Oxford and Abingdon, what further steps is he prepared to take? Because we see in the West Bank these egregious behaviours, and is it really conscionable that Israel is going to respond in a favourable way to the limited but welcome announcement that he's made today?
Foreign Secretary.
What can I say to my honourable friend? I know the strength with which he talks about these issues and has talked consistently about them over many, many years. Let me just make clear that the announcement, Mr. Speaker, that I make today follows a process. It's a process that was set up by the last government in 2021. We have followed that process to the law, and that is why I'm here today. It is in no way to punish Israel. That is not the point of the process. It is to make sure that our export licensing regime remains amongst the very robust in the world. And I recognise what he says about the West Bank particularly, and it's why I went to the region just a few weeks ago once again.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for prior sight of the statement. And of course, we welcome anything which reduces the appalling death toll in Gaza and increasingly, sadly, in the West Bank. But this statement raises so many questions, which I will write to the Foreign Secretary about later. But could I press him on the issue of the UK recognising that the Netanyahu government's use of UK weapons poses a clear risk of the violation of international humanitarian law? You'll be aware that there is no legal definition between what is an offensive weapon and what is a defensive weapon. So why and on what basis, if there is, in his words, a clear risk of the violation of international humanitarian law, why has he not imposed a blanket ban on Israel until that risk has gone away completely?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that we have one of the most robust export licensing regimes in the world. The process requires us to make an assessment about the clear risk in the theatre of conflict. And the theatre of conflict in relation to this is Gaza. And therefore we have made an assessment on the basis of the licences that could be used in Gaza, and I've made the announcement that I've made today. But I think that the honourable gentleman, in the thrust of his remarks, notwithstanding the concerns around international humanitarian law in that theatre of action, should recognise the real threats that Israel faces from Lebanese Hezbollah, should recognise what the Houthis are doing now in the Red Sea, and recently we saw this terrible attack on a Greek oil tanker just over the last few days, and recognise the long-standing relationship that this country has with Israel, and particularly in relation to intelligence and military accession that keeps much of the Middle East and the world safe. And it's for that basis that my remarks are measured, and I defend that.
Laura Kirk-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the Foreign Secretary's decision to suspend certain arms sales to Israel. I also appreciate his acknowledgement that Israel could do much more to allow aid to reach people in Gaza. I'd like to ask the Foreign Secretary what further conversations he's had with the Israeli government to ask them to ensure that aid workers are able to do their vital work safely and effectively, and that aid can get to those who desperately need it.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that the issue of aid workers and the tremendous loss of life of aid workers in this conflict is an issue I have raised directly in all of my meetings with the Israeli government. And there's another issue that sits alongside this, and it's the issue of deconfliction. It must be the case that in any war there are rules. And one of the rules are that aid workers are able to get medical supplies and aid to the civilians that need it. And there have been real issues with deconfliction zones and the amount of aid workers who've died and the amount of UN workers who've died in this conflict. She's absolutely right to raise it.
Sammy Wilson.
Madam Speaker. The only people who will be overjoyed by this decision today will be the Hamas terrorists who murdered in cold blood 6 hostages at the weekend. They have been handed a line of hope that this government will not stand firm in its defence of Israel's right to defend itself. And let's look at the threadbare arguments that the Minister has used today, that these arms might be used to breach international humanitarian law. And yet he admits that the government cannot arbitrate as to whether or not Israel has done so to date, that civilian deaths have been caused, and yet hardly a couple of paragraphs later in this statement, the Minister states that the civilian deaths have been a result of Hamas embedding itself in the civilian population with no regard for those people who have been affected. And the last reason he gives then is that Israel is responsible for these deaths, even though he again admits that it is not possible to determine who is responsible for these deaths, and indeed how many deaths there have been. We rely on Hamas propaganda in most cases for that. I would say to the Minister today that this is a bad decision. It is a decision which we will come to live to regret, and it's one which, unfortunately, I believe has been a result, maybe a lot of the pressure which Labour MPs have found in their seats as a result of Gaza protests.
True.
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman that this party supported British fighters taking to the skies in defence of Israel when missiles were being delivered from Iran. We did that on April the 13th. This party supported the last government in their defence of Israel following the attacks we've seen from the Houthis in the Red Sea. And I would also remind him that I have not gone as far today as Margaret Thatcher went in 1982. Governments of both types, Vince Cable, Liberal Democrat, Gordon Brown, have had to make these difficult decisions. And I stand by both a party and, I hope, at a chamber that recognises the importance of international humanitarian law and the clear risk assessment that we have been required to make sure that we are not in breach of that as a country.
Chianwara. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the government's decision to suspend certain arms licences to Israel. My constituents are horrified by the unimaginable and unacceptable suffering in Gaza and certainly would not want any British exports to contribute to it. And my constituents are also horrified by the unimaginable and unacceptable suffering of the hostages held for over 11 months now, many of whom who have been killed. Now, the Foreign Secretary will have seen the protests in Tel Aviv last night, and the strikes called by Israeli labour unions to try to persuade the Israeli government to strike a deal and bring the hostages home. From his discussions with the Israeli government, what does he see as the main obstacles to a deal which brings the hostages home and which delivers a ceasefire in Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend asks a very good question, and Madam Deputy Speaker, she's absolutely right. What brings this to an end is a ceasefire. And the issues really boil down to the security of Israel once we get to that ceasefire. And she will have read, no doubt, the issues around the Philadelphia corridor particularly, and the ability or Israel's insistence at this stage that they should be present still in Gaza, and that being a matter of discussion. There have been previously also issues around not just the hostages that must come out, and she's absolutely right, those hostages must come out, but also the prisoners that it's hoped would leave Israel's prisons as well, the Palestinian prisoners particularly. But the truth of this is that we are now reaching a decisive point, as Joe Biden has said. We can get there, and we need to get there to bring to an end this horror that's now gone on for many, 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 many months.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary will be very well aware of the decisions made by the ICJ and the ICC. He'll also be very well aware that the world has condemned Israel for its illegal occupation of the West Bank, the settlement policy, and the killing of 40,000 people in Gaza. the suspension of some arms contracts, could he explain what effect that will actually make on Israel's ability to continue the bombardment of Gaza, or will it continue unabated? And will he also explain what role, legally or otherwise, Britain has played in overflying Gaza with surveillance aircraft and the use of RAF Akrotiri as a staging point for aircraft going to Israel, which many people believe are carrying weapons that are used to bomb Gaza?
Foreign Secretary.
I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman is informed on many aspects of these issues. He must know that our exports to Israel amount to about 1%. And in fact, it is the United States and Germany and others that are much more engaged in the selling of arms to Israel. So when he asks me the effect, he can draw his own conclusions in relation to that. I am very comfortable with the support that we give to Israel, and I won't comment on operational issues as he would expect from this dispatch box.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Israeli military F-16 aircraft have dropped thousands of bombs on civilians in Gaza in the last 11 months. UN weapons inspectors confirmed that this includes bombing the premises of aid agencies, Medical Aid for Palestinians and the International Rescue Committee, which housed Palestinian aid workers, international aid workers and doctors in January of this year. F-16s have further killed thousands of Palestinian civilians who had fled their homes to what the Israeli military had designated a safe zone in Al-Mawasi. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary if he will confirm that this arms ban will include licences related to the F-16 and that this is in service, if so, of upholding UK and international law and protecting civilian lives? Can I also express extreme concern at the ongoing Israeli military action in the West Bank? Earlier this year, I was in Tulkarem refugee camp after a military raid, and last year, Jenin refugee camp, days after a military raid, both much smaller than what is happening now. The West Bank and Jerusalem are at boiling point alongside the horrors in Gaza. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary, what action is he taking to uphold international law there as well?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, of course, my honourable friend brings tremendous expertise to this House on the issues on the ground, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank. Can I reassure her that we have fully assessed the export licensing regime and those weapons that might be used in the conflict, and that includes those she mentions, have been excluded. She's quite right to raise the issues of deconfliction, the aid workers who have lost their lives, and I want to reassure her that I have raised these issues with the Prime Minister himself in Israel and with other members of the government, and pressed them hard on these issues. And I know, frankly, in coming into this role, that the former Foreign Secretary did exactly the same. And therefore it's on that basis in many ways that we sadly and regrettably have come to the assessment that I've had to today.
Mike Martin.
So we've had some very strong words from the Foreign Secretary today about how this war must end, and we've also heard words about how important it is that we have a ceasefire to do so, and I take him at his word. But looking forward, what levers does he have, and when is he going to pull them?
The Honourable Gentleman's new to this House, so I tread very gently. But I would urge him to reflect that in the end, to bring about peace, as we saw in Northern Ireland, you need partners for peace. And the principal partners here are Benjamin Netanyahu and Sinwar. And the deal that we have on the table can bring about that peace. And I have to tell him, in the last 8 or 9 weeks in office, I have spent more time on this issue than any other issue pressing to get that ceasefire.
Andy Slaughter.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've seen the most serious incursions into the West Bank for 20 years, and that's under cover of the horror that is happening in Gaza, otherwise it would be leading the news. And towns like Jenin completely cut off, the water supply, the streets ploughed up in that way. What's the government's specific response to this, which is really a form of collective punishment? And has the Foreign Secretary looked at whether arms and equipment are being used specifically in the West Bank?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I say to my very good friend that the UK position is clear. Settlements are completely unacceptable and illegal under international law. They present an obstacle to peace and they threaten the physical viability of a two-state solution. That is why we take this so seriously, and it's why we condemn the settler violence and incitement remarks such as those that were made by Israel's National Security Minister Ben Gvir and the Finance Minister Smodrick. All of these issues we keep under review, and all of these issues I'm discussing with our closest allies.
Ben Lake.
Speaker, amid the devastation of bombardment and the collapse in civilian infrastructure, civilians in Gaza must now contend with polio. As has already been mentioned this afternoon, to be effective, the UN vaccination programme needs to attain some 90% population coverage. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary for his assessment of the initial progress of the scheme and what steps his government is taking to help facilitate a swift and hopefully effective rollout?
Well done.
Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful to the question, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's horrendous that polio has returned after 2 decades of absence in Gaza. That is why we convened and pressed to get this pause, to get these children vaccinated in Gaza, so that we can not see a new flowering of that horrendous disease and affliction. And I hope he will commend the leadership that we've shown and the leadership we saw in the UN Security Council to bring about this vaccination programme in the last few days.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We are all desperate to see an end to the suffering on all sides in this conflict. The Iranian regime and its proxies are one of the biggest barriers to ending that conflict and achieving a sustainable ceasefire. Will the Secretary of State agree with me that tackling the threat from Iran is vital, and will he update us on his plans to prescribe the IRGC?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful for the question, and I would not want the House to lose sight of the further sanctions that I've announced of the 4 individuals in the House this afternoon, and you can revisit the statement just to be abreast of that. He's absolutely right about the dangers that the IRGC poses, and indeed it's been important for me in these early weeks in office to engage with my Iranian counterpart and to urge de-escalation, particularly in relation to any action that Iran is contemplating. This remains the very, very biggest and most important of issues for us here in the UK. It is absolutely right to keep it centre stage.
Ellie Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The news of suspension of some export licences is indeed welcome, and I know there are many in my constituency across the country who will be glad to hear this. But I'm alarmed that it seems that the principle underpinning criterion 2C is being inconsistently applied here, and in particular the justification that the Foreign Secretary has offered for not suspending licences for the F-35 appears inconsistent. There does appear to be clear evidence of clear risk. There are online posts, I understand, from the IDF indicating that F-35s have been used in bombing Gaza. And so I'd like to urge the Secretary of State to review this case again and to suspend those licences. Can I ask him also, please, to clarify whether licensing continues for R902W Wankel engines,
because they were involved in the World Central Kitchen attack on humanitarian workers. Thank you.
The Honourable Lady asked important questions around the F-35, and it is important for me to state that in looking at the F-35, it's important to understand that there is a global supply chain. She will recognise threats, very, very serious threats that exist across much of the globe in other terrible theatres of conflict. I think were she in my situation, she too would make the judgment that we should do nothing to equip those who would cause tremendous harm in relation to this decision. And that's why it has been important, never mind the ability to actually distinguish across that multiple supply chain that involves many nations, those particular equipments that she, those particular bits of armoury that she's talking about.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The children of Gaza have faced an onslaught from above and now the spread of disease. And I would just like to ask that the Foreign Secretary of State considers once again bringing those who are most vulnerable to the UK for medical treatment. Polio has a lasting impact and could need a lot more support for people if they've already been infected with lifelong disabilities. We've also got children who have need amputations and life-altering operations that they haven't been able to access the right quality of care because hospitals have just not been there. Can we look at this again? Other countries are doing it. Let us be part of it.
Yeah. Foreign Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend raises a very important issue, and that is why I and the member for Oxford East made the statements in our first weeks in office in relation to supporting UK Med and restoring the funding to UNRWA to ensure that those children get the medical aid that they need at this time. Now, I'm afraid my assessment is across Gaza, it's not sufficient for the reasons that I've discussed. But it was important that we put all the aid and money we could to that endeavour, particularly on behalf of those young children. And there's another issue that I'm tremendously concerned about. It's the amount of young people not in school. This has gone on for months, and young people must be in school.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his answers? I defend the right of Israel to protect all of its people, the same as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland did for its own citizens against IRA terrorism, and as Ukraine has done against Russian aggression, ever mindful of that. So our hearts ache with those hostage families who have received the news that they have feared and dreaded for almost a year, and even more forcibly underlines the need to ensure that either the hostages or the remains are brought home, and that steps can be taken for peace in the Middle East, which is all of our goal. I know it's the Minister's goal, it's the goal of everyone in this House. Will the Minister outline what further steps that can be taken along with our allies to bring this peace, this much needed peace, about? Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, can I just say to the honourable gentleman that today's decision relates to an independent process relation to, of course, to our strategic export licensing criteria. It comes on yet another day of tremendous pain for those hostage families, and I'm acutely aware of that. And it's why I've sought to speak to those families, of course those who have a relationship with our own country, but those beyond as well, and to meet with those families when I've been in Israel. My heart bleeds for them. The pain and the suffering that they're going through is torturous. That there are so many left is unbelievable. And to have gone so many months not knowing whether your loved one is alive or dead is horrific. And anyone who looks at the front pages of the international news and looks at those beautiful young people who have been taken from us in the most horrific of ways Frankly, it brings tears to the eyes. And I feel so much, I offer my deepest condolences, and all of us do, to those families who've learnt they've lost their loved ones over the last few days.
Apsana Begum.
The Foreign Secretary announced 30 of approximately 350 export arms licenses will now be suspended. That is still less than 10% of the total number of export arms licenses to Israel. Given that over 40,000 Palestinians have now been killed, given that Israel is expanding its military operations in the occupied West Bank, and given that a former Foreign Office official resigned, stating, and I quote, that it is actually quite clear that Israel is perpetuating war crimes in plain sight, will the UK government ensure that the UK is not complicit in Israel's war crimes and suspend all arms sales to Israel?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I've followed the quasi-legal process that we have in this country. We've got one of the most robust regimes in the world. I stand by the decision that I've made that approximately 30 export licenses to Israel should be suspended at this time. And yes, it does represent 10% because it's the 10% that could be used in the theatre of conflict that we're concerned with. But I would also just gently say to the Honourable Lady that there are many things that we might sell that I don't think anyone would suggest a helmet or goggles we shouldn't be selling to one of our closest allies. And so you make that assessment in a measured way, in a sober way, on behalf of the British people, and I'm satisfied with the assessment that's been made.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Foreign Secretary's decision to withdraw some of the arms, or the licenses to arms? I'm confident, even though our arms trade is insignificant, it's bound to have a repercussion on other countries that provide arms licenses. So I certainly welcome that. But what steps can the Foreign Secretary do in liaising with his Israeli counterparts in relation to the Palestinian children which are now going to receive vaccinations for polio, and they're being moved from pillar to post without a real safe zone? Will the Foreign Secretary seek assurances that they will be given a safe zone and not blown away after giving their polio vaccinations?
Foreign Secretary.
Yes.
Catherine Frooks.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you, Foreign Secretary, for your statement. I absolutely share your pain, your horror and your dismay at the number of innocent civilians killed in Gaza. I received a letter from constituents under the banner of Families for a Ceasefire recently, signed by over 70 families in Monmouthshire, calling for a ceasefire and a ban on all arms sales to Israel. So I welcome the suspension of the 30 arms licences, but could my right honourable friend share with us when the further review of the remaining licences will be available, and also look at encouraging other countries around the world to do as we have done and suspend their licences to Israel? Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I recognise that this is a really big issue for her constituents, and I recall being in Wales a few months ago and this being raised with both of us as an issue when I was in opposition and speaking on behalf of the opposition benches. Our regime is our regime. Different countries will have different arrangements, and it is for them democratically to determine those arrangements, and they will have made a range of different assessments. And she'll also understand that, as I said, there are really only 2 or 3 countries that sell substantial amounts to Israel, and we are not one of them, in truth. The assessment that has been reached, regrettably, today, I think should satisfy all those who've been concerned with any breaches of international humanitarian law on the basis of a clear risk, which is the export licensing criteria. As I said in my statement, it is not a judgment. It is not for me or the government or any of us in this place to act as judge and jury. That is a matter for the appropriate international courts and must be determined in the usual way. And so I just emphasise it's the clear risk judgment on our export licence regime that is required me to make this judgment.
Chris Murray.
Thank you. I welcome the government's statement today, and I know that many of my constituency will as well. Our overwhelming priority must be an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that both sides must come to a table to end this conflict, and will the Foreign Office strain every diplomatic sinew to effect it?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, yes, I say to my honourable friend, we need a ceasefire now, and it is in the hands of the major actors here to bring that about and get those hostages out, get that hostage deal. And so many families in Israel want to see that hostage deal and bring the suffering of the Palestinian people to an end so that the aid can get it in the quantities that's required. It's within our reach. I had hoped, I'll be honest with him, I had hoped that we would have reached that point by now. But we must still reach to get there over the coming days.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've been talking about polio today because tragically we've learned about how this infectious disease is taking a grip in Gaza with the tragic diagnosis that we've had. However, there are many commutable diseases within Gaza which are spreading, and therefore just focusing on polio will not be sufficient to save lives. What further steps can he take to ensure that those windows of vaccination, of treatment, and for bringing cure can be extended so more life can be saved?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising these issues. Can I assure her that myself and my colleague, the member for Oxford East, are on these issues, that our support for all medical aid in Gaza is paramount, and that sitting alongside the medical context, of course, is the nutrition context and the threat of famine and starvation, particularly, that leads to so many medical ailments. So she's right to emphasise these issues, and I can only say to her that we continue to work, particularly the UK particularly works on this front.
Alice MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Foreign Secretary rightly said in his statement that famine is looming ever larger in Gaza and, of course, just mentioned the issue of hunger and malnutrition. Yet the World Food Programme has only managed to bring in half the aid needed and indeed recently suspended movements of his staff after they came under attack. Can the Foreign Secretary expand on the assessment of hunger and malnutrition levels in Gaza and the specific action that the government is taking to push for unimpeded access to food aid?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising this issue. It is of tremendous concern that over the last few days the World Food Programme have suspended their activities in Gaza because their own workers have come under attack for the issues of deconfliction that has been raised already in this House, given the tremendous concern across the House about nutrition, about starvation, and about famine. We will be redoubling our efforts over the coming days and working with international partners to see that people do not go without the food that would keep them from the famine status.
Matthew Patrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's call for an immediate ceasefire. That's the route for hostages to be returned home and for aid to flow into all corners of Gaza. I welcome the Foreign Secretary's call for a two-state solution, the only route to a lasting peace in the region. I also welcome the clarity that there is no moral equivalence between the Israeli government and the heinous action and intent of Hamas. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary what steps can be taken to stop or stem the flow of money and aid and weapons from Iran to its proxies who are so determined to bring about Israel's total destruction?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I'm very grateful to the tone of the Honourable Gentleman's remarks. He's absolutely right to put the spotlight on Iran, and it's why I've announced further sanctions today It's why we keep the position of the IRGC under close review. It's why I've spoken to the Iranians twice in the last few weeks and urged de-escalation. It's why also I've been to Lebanon and met with the Prime Minister, the Speaker and others, and those who could get messages to Hezbollah. We have amongst the very best military intelligence capability in the world, working with our partners. These are issues of utmost importance in relation to global security.
That concludes that statement, and before we move on to the next statement, we'll let the front benches change over. Before I call the Home Secretary to make her statement, I will remind the House that several hundred people have been charged with criminal offences relating to these disturbances. Most of these cases are still before the courts. Public order is a matter of national importance, and I am therefore granting a limited waiver to the House's sub judice resolution in the following terms. Members may make statements of fact about the circumstances of the unrest, about the number of people arrested, charged and sentenced, and about the kinds of behaviour exhibited during these events. However, they may not refer to specific individuals who have been charged and are awaiting trial, or engage in any discussion or speculation about individual cases. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Before I start, I want to pass our sympathies to the families of Sher Maximan and Musi Mnetu, who died sadly this weekend following violent incidents around Notting Hill Carnival. And our thoughts are with their friends and families at this terrible time, and our thanks go to the police who moved swiftly to charge suspects in both cases. There is no place for such appalling, senseless violence on our streets, and this government is determined to stamp out the scourge of serious violence wherever it is found. With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will now make a statement on the violent disorder that occurred earlier this summer. Just before the parliamentary recess, I made a statement to this House on the horrendous attack that took place in Southport on the 29th of July. 5 weeks on, our hearts still ache for the 3 precious little girls who lost their lives, for their loved ones, and for the other children who were injured or endured unspeakable horror that day. The House will know that a suspect has been charged and the investigation into the attack is ongoing. Those grieving families, the Southport community and the country will need answers, but for that reason the legal process must now take its course. That day in the House, all of us came together in sorrow and in solidarity with the families and with the people of Southport. And I spoke of the bravery, the compassion and the distress of the police, the paramedics and the firefighters that I had met that morning who were first on the scene. So it is truly appalling that within hours of that statement, those same Southport police were facing the most disgraceful, violent attacks from criminals and thugs. Police officers pelted with bricks and bottles, the local mosque, a place of worship, subjected to violent attack. And while millions of decent people across the country were praying for bereaved families, a criminal minority of thugs and extremists saw only an opportunity to hijack a town's grief. The Merseyside Chief Constable, Serena Kennedy, spoke at the funeral of Alice de Silva Aguiar, and she said she hoped that anyone taking part in the violent disorder was hanging their head in shame at the pain that they had caused the bereaved family. In the days that followed, we saw further disgraceful violent disorder in a number of towns and cities, repeated attacks on the very police officers whose job it is to keep communities safe, over 100 officers injured. In Sunderland, a citizens' advice branch set alight. In Liverpool, a library and vital community hub was torched. In Hull, shops were looted and a mosque was targeted. In Rotherham, a hotel used as asylum accommodation was set alight when people were inside. In Bolton, clashes between rival groups involved fireworks and bottles thrown. And we saw people targeted on the streets because of the colour of their skin. This disgraceful disorder and racist hatred, including that whipped up by a hateful minority online, was an insult to those grieving over Southport. So let us be very clear, those violent and criminal attacks were not protests, they were not about grievance, they were thuggery, racism and crime. Plenty of people across the country have strong views about crime, about policing, about immigration, asylum, the NHS and more, but they don't pick up bricks and throw them at the police. They don't loot shops or attack places of worship, and they don't set buildings alight knowing that other human beings are inside. There's lots to debate on all kinds of policy issues, but no one should make excuses for violence or thuggery that risks public safety. This was brazen criminality perpetrated in many cases by those with existing criminal convictions. The Prime Minister and I made clear that criminals would pay the price for their violence, and we meant it. The Prime Minister announced a new National Violent Disorder Programme to bring together the best policing capabilities and enhance intelligence sharing across forces. And ministers worked daily with the police and criminal justice partners to ensure that there was a strong and determined response. The National Police Coordination Centre operated a national mobilisation plan to ensure strategic reserves of public order officers were ready to be deployed in support of different police forces. Over 40,000 officer shifts were worked by public order officers over 10 days, with over 6,600 public order officers deployed on one day alone. Rest days were cancelled, additional hours were worked. The Crown Prosecution Service deployed over 100 additional prosecutors, boosting their 24-hour charging service with additional advice from the Director of Public Prosecutions so they could move swiftly to charge. The Ministry of Justice accelerated the work on new cells to bring 500 more prison places on stream earlier, and the Lord Chancellor made clear that the courts stood ready to hear all the cases coming through. And the Home Office established new rapid procedure for security support for mosques to ensure that communities felt supported and felt safe. In total, around 1,280 people have been arrested, around 800 charges have been made, and over 570 individuals have been brought before the courts for offences like violent disorder, assaults on emergency workers, arson, and for encouraging violent attacks online. This robust and swift response from government and the criminal justice system has provided a strong deterrent and showed our steadfast determination to keep people safe. And most importantly, order was restored. But I want now to just update the House on some of the next steps we will take. First, we will take forward positive policing reform to build on the important work done by the National Police Coordination Centre this summer. I want particularly to thank the Chair of the National Police Chiefs Council and Public Order Lead for the mobilisation work that they did. But the reality is that the coordination infrastructure and systems that they had to work with were too weak. And I'm therefore asking His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services to work quickly with the MPCC, the College of Policing and National Lead for Public Order to review the lessons from this summer's events so we can ensure strong coordination intelligence systems are in place and that there is sufficient public order policing for the future. Second, as well as ensuring there's proper punishment for those responsible for the disorder, we'll be pressing forward at pace with this government's mission to take back the safety of our streets and restore respect for the police and rule of law. We will put thousands more neighbourhood police officers and PCSOs back on the streets, reversing the collapse in community policing and rebuilding the relationship between local communities and forces. And this government is very clear. Wherever and whenever violence and disorder emerges, whether in Hartlepool or Hare Hills, Sunderland or Stoke, we expect crimes to face consequences and perpetrators to face the full force of the law. And the criminal violence we saw after the Southport attacks was not the only violent disorder this summer. We also saw disgraceful arson and attacks on the police in Hare Hills. In that case too, 32 people have been arrested And in the last week, 3 men have pled guilty for arson and violent disorder after a bus was set alight. But third, I've been concerned for a long time not enough is being done to counter extremism, including both Islamist extremism and far-right extremism, as there's been no proper strategy in place since 2015. I have ordered a rapid review of extremism to ensure we have the strongest possible response to poisonous ideologies that corrode community cohesion and fray the fabric of our democracy. And alongside that, the Deputy Prime Minister is overseeing cross-government work to consider how we support our communities and address issues of cohesion in the longer term. Fourth, the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology will strengthen the requirements for social media companies to take responsibility for the poison proliferated on their platforms with the rollout of the measures in the Online Safety Act, and we will continue to be clear that criminal content online results in criminal sanctions offline. And fifth, we stand ready to support the police through the Special Grant for Policing, and the Home Office will work with police and crime commissioners to ensure that the Riot Compensation Act works effectively in the areas that are affected. Madam Deputy Speaker, the country recoiled in horror at the scenes of violence and disorder in some cities and towns earlier in this summer. But let there be no doubt, the minority of criminal and thugs who sought to cause havoc do not represent Britain. Instead, across the country, we saw decent people coming together to support each other, to clean up the damage, to rebuild communities. The bricklayers who repaired the wall of the Southport Mosque, the residents who donated funds and books to restock the Spellow Library, the volunteers in Sunderland who found a new site to offer community advice, and there are so many more examples. And those small, unassuming acts of selflessness should serve as a message to the criminals and extremists that they do not speak for Britain and they never will. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary James Cleverly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for an advanced copy of her statements. And I wish once again to pay my respects to the victims of the Southport attacks. The murder of 3 young girls in Southport was horrific, and our thoughts are with them, their families, their friends, and of course the local community. My thoughts are also with the families and friends of those who were killed at the Notting Hill Carnival. The government and Mayor of London must do more to end the criminality and violence which too regularly mars this event, and they must bring forward credible plans to improve the safety of this well ahead of next year's carnivals. I pay tribute to the bravery of our police officers across the country who put themselves in harm's way to deal with the violence perpetrated by thugs this summer. There is not and can never be any excuse, justification or rationale for the violent disorder that we have seen. We cannot and will not let rioting thugs or extremists win. The government must always back our police officers to do what is necessary to maintain law and order, and attacks on the police by any group must not be tolerated. And intimidation of the public or the media cannot be allowed. So does the Home Secretary now see that the comments made by one of her own ministers at the time of the riots, seemingly making excuses for armed thugs intimidating the media, undermines the government's credibility, reinforces the accusations of bias, and puts people, including police officers, at increased risk? And does she now also recognise that the Labour leadership kneeling in the immediate aftermath of the Black Lives Matter disorder, when violent protesters attacked police officers, looks like her party takes some forms of violence less seriously than other forms of violence? And does she accept that any perception whatsoever of treating the same crimes differently based on the race, religion or community of the perpetrators increases tension rather than reduces it? And does she accept that at times of heightened tension, government ministers must be and must seen to be even-handed and demand even-handedness of others? Does she also recognise that the delay in holding a COBRA meeting until almost a week after these events started was a mistake? That it created a vacuum and delayed the actions which could have brought this disorder to an end more quickly? At the time of the disorder, the Prime Minister claimed he would create, and I quote, a standing army of public order police officers. What progress has been made in the intervening weeks to make that claim a reality? After the murder of the 3 young girls in Southport, the Right Honourable Lady and I discussed across the dispatch box the impact of misinformation and disinformation online. When I was Home Secretary, I travelled to the United States to deliver this message directly to the leadership of the tech firms and make
House of Commons sound. House of Commons sound. House of Commons sound. House of Commons sound.
Introduced by the Conservative government when I was on her side of the House, to ensure that the police are able to take firm action and clamp down on crime with all the force that the law allows, without the fear of being strung up for years in endless investigations. In government, we recruited 20,000 new police officers, but they will be hampered in their work if they do not feel supported by the government when they take the firm action needed to keep the people of this country safe. Violence has absolutely no place on our streets. Anyone who engages in violent disorder or commits violent crimes must face the full force of the law, no matter who they are. And we will continue to hold the government to account to ensure that they deal with disorder swiftly, effectively, fairly, and even-handedly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, look, I welcome, obviously, the Shadow Home Secretary's words of support for the Southport families and his reassertion that there can be no excuse for violent disorder. But I have to say the rest of his response sounded an awful lot more like a pitch to Tory party members in the middle of a leadership election than it did a serious response to the scale of the disorder that we saw and the need for a serious policing response. So he asked the issue around the strategic reserve. He asked about the standing army. We set up the strategic reserve. It was in place for the second weekend, and we had thousands of police officers who were ready, not the old arrangements that he used to, that we inherited from him, where mutual aid was had to be on call and had to be stood up in a rush when it was called for, but we actually got the police public order officers ready and deployed at strategic locations around the country so that they could move fast in order to be able to be there when they were needed. And this really goes to the heart of the problems that we inherited from the Home Secretary, the Shadow Home Secretary, and from my predecessor. The central coordination that he had left in place was far too weak. The officers, the chief officers who were involved in trying to get mutual aid in place, trying to coordinate intelligence, had very weak infrastructure, very weak systems in place. They hadn't been supported over very, very many years. In fact, some of his predecessors had tried to get rid of a lot of the work of the National Policing Coordination Centre. So our approach instead is to say that we should strengthen it. We believe that we should strengthen that coordination and we should strengthen the central coordination. We will work with the police to do so, and that is why I have asked the Inspectorate to operate. Secondly, he refers the issues around, seriously, I mean, on social media, the action against social media, his party delayed the Online Safety Act for years, year after year. My colleague, the Secretary of State for Science and Technology, has already been working closely to put more pressure onto the social media companies, but his party did nothing for years. It is far too late for them to try and call for action. The policing use of force review is important and will continue. But I have to say to him finally, this issue about he is playing all these games undermining the credibility of the police. Trying to blame the Prime Minister for something that happened 4 years ago is somehow responsible for the violent disorder on our streets this summer, and also undermining the credibility of police officers who take an oath. Each individual officer takes an oath to operate without fear or favour. And I would just remind him, his predecessor, the previous Home Secretary, was the one who first tried to undermine and attack the credibility of the police in the run-up to Armistice Day, and that is why we then ended up with a bunch of thugs trying to get to the cenotaph to disrupt the service and launching violent attacks on the police. That's the only reason he got the job of Home Secretary in the first place, because everyone condemned his predecessor for her behaviour. I'm so sorry that he's decided in a leadership election to follow her example rather than something that I really thought he was better than.
Andy Slaughter.
What a surprise. Can I compliment the Home Secretary and the Lord Chancellor on the robust response that the whole criminal justice system took to the recent riots and violent disorder? But was she, like me, concerned about the number of very young people who have been taking part, pre-teen in some cases? What does she think is the solution, both to rehabilitation and preventing in the future young people of that age becoming involved in this disgraceful behaviour?
My honourable friend makes a really important point about the number of young people involved. Some of those who were involved had a string of convictions, a string of past history, but there were also young people who were drawn into violence and disorder, sometimes in antisocial behaviour and looting of shops, sometimes into serious violence as well. And I think there is an important issue about how we prevent young people getting drawn into violence and antisocial behaviour. It's one of the reasons we are so determined to set up the Young Futures programme. It's also one of the reasons that I think we need to look at online radicalisation of young people as well as part of the extremism review.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of the statement and associate myself and my party with her comments and her praise for the bravery and professionalism of the police and the other emergency services that we saw throughout these disgraceful episodes. Madam Deputy Speaker, I think this is a moment for everyone in this House to make it clear which side they are on. It simply is not credible to talk about two-tier policing and then in this next breath to say that you also support the police. The Home Secretary is correct to call out the disorder that we've seen for what it is. She says thuggery, racism and crime. So we support on these benches the steps that she has announced, but does she agree that actually this renders urgent the need to appoint an independent advisor on Islamophobia, a post that has been vacant for the last 2 years, and also to have a formal definition of Islamophobia in order to underpin and inform government policy across the board and across all departments?
And I welcome the honourable member's support for the police and the work that they did, and the importance of ensuring that these kinds of crimes are not tolerated and that they should face consequences. He's right that there were significant attacks on mosques, one of the reasons why we brought forward the work around mosque security, and he's also right that we do need to challenge Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hate, wherever it is found, and the Deputy Prime Minister is taking forward that work.
Patrick Hurley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary rightly started her statement by remembering the victims of the horrific attack in my Southport constituency, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank her for that. It's one of the most appalling aspects of the disorder that we saw across the country last month, that we continually heard the claim from the thugs involved that they'd been driven to commit their acts of violence by the killing of little BB, Elsie Dot and Alice. That claim is a grotesque lie. And no one is more furious about that lie than the people of Southport.
who wanted to just be allowed to deal with their grief and their anguish in their own way, and to support the families of those who'd been killed. It's no surprise to me that some of the targets of the violence were places of worship, Citizens Advice Bureau, a library. These are the places where communities go when they heal each other, when they are driven to improve each other and driven to improve themselves. And the thugs who attacked those targets set their face against that community self-improvement. So it's no surprise that they were the targets that they attacked. For those who continue to propagate the lie that there were justifiable concerns from the thuggery that we saw, or that the actions of the mob are somehow justified, I'd like to ask the Home Secretary to please reiterate that what happened in Southport provides no justification at all for anyone throwing bricks at the police, for anyone attacking people in their own cars or burning down buildings with people inside them, and that for anyone to pretend otherwise is too horrific for words.
Can I thank my honourable friend for his powerful words on behalf of his constituents, and also his work to stand up for his constituents and the people of Southport, and for those families who had to endure the most unspeakable horror and are still having to deal with the consequences of what happened. And his words for them and for his community about how no one should ever use the terrible attack on 3 little girls as being an excuse for the kinds of violent disorder that we have seen is absolutely right. I am so sorry that the families he represents and the community he represents has had to endure not just the original attack, but also people claiming to be doing things in the name of Southport when clearly they have not been doing, and it is simply crime.
Sir Julian Lewis.
The Home Secretary agree that one of the reasons why what might be called her shock and awe policy successfully shut down the violence so quickly was the speed with which the offenders were brought before the courts and sentenced. And if she does agree with that as a deterrent for the future, how can that model be adapted in other areas of justice?
I think the Honourable Member makes a really important point here, because there's no doubt that the swift response, the policing swift response, the prosecution swift response and the criminal justice system swift response clearly had a very strong impact and clearly was a deterrent and an overwhelming signal to people that if they get involved in disorder, they will pay the price. And he's right, really the implicit thing in his question is that there are long delays in the criminal justice system at the moment. We have seen long delays often in prosecutions. It's why it's one of the things that we are keen to work closely on is the better cooperation between policing and the prosecution, CPS, in order to be able to remove some of the bureaucracy in place, in order to be able to speed up charges. But it's why we do recognise there has been a lot of damage to the criminal justice system. We do need to turn that round, because that is fundamental to respect for the rule of law.
Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I just put on record what a powerful statement from the Honourable Member from Southport. There is no excuse to be racist or to use the innocent lives of Elsie, Alison and Bibi. Thank you, my honourable friend, for mentioning Chair Maximum and Musi Imnetu. And it is important in this House that we're all mindful about the language that we use and when we use it and how we use it, especially when we're referring to immigration and migration. And it is also important that we not only talk about thuggery, racism, but also Islamophobia. The rise in racism is frightening. And Love Music, Hate Racism are doing a lot of work around raging against hate. And I hope my right honourable friends will help and encourage them in that work. And will my honourable friend agree with me that we do need stronger regulations around social media companies?
Well, I welcome the points that my honourable friend has made. And I think one of the really most troubling things that we saw during those days of violence disorder was people feeling fearful to be out on the streets because of the colour of their skin. And that should never happen in our country. And that is why we do have to challenge racism, we do have to challenge extremism wherever it is found. My honourable friend, the Secretary of State, Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Science and Technology, is bringing forward the measures in the Online Safety Act, which will require social media companies to take action where there is criminal content. There has been considerable concern about criminal content remaining online, and we do need the social media companies to take responsibility for that.
Gavin Robinson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and welcome to the Chair. Can I agree with the Home Secretary about her condemnation of violence, and indeed I suspect her unwillingness to open up this statement because she wants the voice of this House to be one of condemnation of violence. She is right about that, and she will know that the streets of Northern Ireland faced the same difficulties that England faced over the course of the summer. Almost 20 PSNI officers injured on our streets, and they benefited from the mutual aid support from Police Scotland during that time. She's not responsible for policing in Northern Ireland, but she is responsible for immigration policy throughout the United Kingdom. Can I ask her at some stage to indicate to this House and to the country what steps she will take to repair the damage of the last government through the Illegal Migration Act and the Safety of Rwanda Act, which specifically for the first time now do not apply in Northern Ireland following court judgment because of the Windsor Framework. We no longer have a uniform immigration policy in this country. And can I ask her as Home Secretary what steps she will take to address that?
Can I first join the honourable member in condemning the appalling violent disorder that we saw on the streets of Belfast, some of the disorder that we saw in Northern Ireland, and also to welcome the support from Police Scotland and the mutual aid that took place. He raises important issues about immigration policy. I'm very happy to debate those, also to talk to him directly further about this. It's important. There are a whole series of areas where reforms are going to be needed, and there's an important debate to take place around border security, around the asylum system, around the way immigration rules operate, and so on, where there are reforms that this government wants to bring forward. I simply think that it is really important that no one excuses the kind of violent disorder we saw as being somehow related to issues about policy, where lots of people have really strong views about immigration policy. They don't pick up bricks and throw them at the police.
Jonathan Brash.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the violence that took place in my constituency of Hartlepool on the 31st of July was perpetrated by a minority of violent thugs, and I would like to place on record my thanks to the police, some of whom ended up in hospital that evening as a result of them defending their town and the people who live there. It's undoubtedly the case that the violence that we saw was fuelled by the lies and misinformation that are largely, although not exclusively, perpetrated online. What can you do, Home Secretary, to challenge and prevent the spread of this misinformation, and to clear the way to allow us to have the debate, the wider debate about asylum and immigration that decent, hard-working people want to have, free from these lies?
Well, my honourable friend is right that there has been continual misinformation and often deliberate misinformation as well. I would also say, though, that I think those who made the decision to choose to get involved in violent disorder attacks on the police, attacks on shops, the looting, the disgraceful attacks, they have to take responsibility for their own actions. They cannot blame things that they saw online for that. They have to take responsibility for their own actions. But equally, we have also been made clear that what is criminal offline is also criminal online, and there is important responsibility on those posting online, but also the social media companies to make sure that criminal content is taken down. He's also right, we should be able to have a serious debate about issues around immigration, about issues around asylum, about issues around the stronger border controls, for example, that this government wants to see and to bring in. But I do think that is separate from the kind of violent disorder that we saw, and nobody should use policy issues around crime and policing, around any issue, as being any kind of excuse for violence on our streets.
Joy Morrissey.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What percentage of these cases were dealt with by district judges rather than the lay magistrate, and where was that change made within the CPS, and will those changes be applied to new disorders, for example, committed by Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil, and will they be applied to the Manchester Airport incident?
So the Honourable Member will know that the charging decisions and also which courts take the decisions is obviously not a matter for government, rightly so. These are independent matters, both for the CPS and for the courts and for the judicial system. I'm happy to write to her with detailed information about the numbers of cases that have been dealt with in the different courts, as I don't have that information to hand.
Chris Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Home Secretary for her statement and echo her acknowledgement for the remarkable courage and dedication of the police. Last month, officers across the country and in my constituency of Blackpool South faced significant challenges as they bravely stood against a barrage of projectiles, working diligently to protect our local mosque, hotels and town centres from hateful extremists seeking to disrupt our communities. Lancashire Police were outstanding. They stood tall and resolute in the face of adversity, just like I'd seen countless times when I was serving as Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner. So will the Home Secretary join me in thanking all those police across our country, and especially in Lancashire, and acknowledge that we are fortunate to have such a dedicated, brave and professional group of officers who are at the front line battling crime and disorder?
And I welcome the points that my honourable friend has made, and just put on record my strong gratitude towards police officers across the country and my tribute to them. Officers who gave up their rest days, who worked additional overtime, who were particularly stretched during that period in August to make sure that they had enough public order trained police on the streets. They did a remarkable job, and all of us should show them our gratitude and our support.
Pete Wishart.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think first of all we in Scotland are grateful that we were spared any of the violence that we saw throughout the rest of the United Kingdom. But where she says she wants a debate, does she accept that the way that immigrants and asylum seekers are being portrayed by a whole host of political voices has helped to foster and ferment and even encourage some of the scenes that we witnessed? And those that have been whipping up this type of activity must be held to account, as are those that peddled the misinformation. And will she also help that debate by talking a little bit more positively about immigration, stop demonising asylum seekers, and will she try and encourage that we do have that debate, but it's a better debate?
Well, I certainly think we should have sort of honest and practical debates about issues rather than debates that end up being lost in rhetoric and often losing sight of the facts and the practical issues as well. I do also think that some of what we saw was we have seen extremism as well as local criminals and thugs. Sometimes it was people who had a violent history of crime in the local area who also got involved in this. And so I think in terms of dealing with the disorder, we have to deal with all the different aspects and all the different origins of it as well.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful for the strong leadership that the Home Secretary has shown on this, and the truth is these events did not happen in a vacuum. That's why after 3 days of distress and panic in Walthamstow, because somebody published a list suggesting that thugs were going to come to our community, thousands of people took to our streets. They stood with members of our local mosques and churches, holding hands with them to keep them safe. They helped businesses board up their properties. We even had knitters against Nazis. But the truth is, we know in Walthamstow, which is we're grateful for that solidarity, that the fear endures even after the immediate threat has gone. And that is the challenge that we have to deal with in this place. Those people who promote anger rather than answers to the challenges that we face in our society. The Home Secretary has talked about a review. Can she set out for us actually what she means by far-right extremism and what we will mean by these terms? Because those details matter in being able to have these debates and give confidence to those communities that are targeted that we stand with them, as we did in Walthamstow that day, and we will do every day.
I'm going to thank my honourable friend for her question. Look, nobody in Britain should ever feel afraid because of the colour of their skin. And that is the really troubling thing that we found people saying and feeling as a result of the violent disorder that we saw earlier in the summer. I have set up a review around countering extremism. I have had concerns for a long time that not enough is being done to counter extremism in this country, and that means both the far-right extremism and also Islamist extremism and some of the other forms of changing extremism that don't fit necessarily into the